The man who made kings, he never wore a crown. He never called himself king. And yet, 2 kings would owe him their thrones, and one would owe him his ruin. This is the story of Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, the man history calls the Kingmaker. In the mid-15th century, England was not a kingdom at peace. The crown, passed from hand to trembling hand, was both prize and curse. The ruling house of Lancaster, under King Henry VI, was fractured. Weak leadership, rising taxes, and foreign humiliation had corroded royal authority. Nobles turned to private armies, and loyalty became currency. Into this chaos was born Richard Neville, son of the powerful Neville family of the North. By blood he was noble. By marriage he would become one of the richest men in England. But by talent, by sheer force of personality, he would become something greater. The broker of power, the architect behind thrones. From the beginning, Warwick was a man shaped by ambition and opportunity. Through his marriage to Anne Beauchamp, the heiress of vast estates, he inherited more than land. He inherited leverage. His holdings stretched from the Midlands to the north, commanding men, money, and loyalty. In a world where influence was measured in swords, Warwick owned an army of them. But his greatest weapon was not his sword. It was his instinct for power. When civil war erupted between the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, Warwick saw not chaos, but a game to be played. His father-in-law, Richard Beauchamp, had served kings loyally. Warwick, however, would make and unmake them. He allied himself with the Yorkist cause, led by Richard, Duke of York, a brilliant but restless noble who claimed the throne from Henry VI. In 1455, the first major clash of the Wars of the Roses broke out, the Battle of St. Albans. Warwick's tactical skill and ferocity turned the tide for the Yorkists. Henry VI was captured. The war had only begun, but a legend was born. Men whispered that Warwick fought like destiny itself favoured him. Over the next decade, his influence deepened. When the Duke of York fell, Warwick became mentor and protector to his son, a young, ambitious man named Edward. Together, they would reshape England. By 1461, Warwick's control over the Yorkist faction was near absolute. His fleets ruled the Channel. His castles, Warwick, Middleham, Calais, became centres of military might and political intrigue. Even foreign ambassadors bowed to his reputation, calling him the greatest man in all England after the king. But there was no king yet, only a battlefield waiting for one. At Towton, in the bloodiest single battle ever fought on English soil, Warwick's strategy brought victory to the White Rose. The exhausted, wounded, and defiant Edward Plantagenet rode into London a conqueror. And as snow and blood mingled in the mud of Yorkshire, Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, stood at his side. It was Warwick who placed the crown on Edward's head. It was Warwick who proclaimed him King Edward IV of England. And it was Warwick who would learn, too late, that the man who makes kings can never truly control them. Power in 15th century England did not spring from the sword alone. It flowed through bloodlines, through marriage, inheritance, and the careful weaving of names. And Richard Neville understood this better than any man alive. Born in 1428 at Warwick Castle, Richard was heir to one of England's oldest and most formidable families. The Nevilles were not mere nobles. They were a dynasty, proud, ambitious, and deeply entangled in the politics of the realm. His father, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, had been a shrewd statesman, serving both Lancaster and York when it suited his cause. From him, young Warwick learned the art of survival, the subtle dance between loyalty and opportunity. But the son would go further than the father. Through marriage to Anne Beauchamp, daughter and co-heiress of the Earl of Warwick, Richard secured something no soldier could win on the field: immense wealth. When Anne's inheritance passed to him, he became Earl of Warwick in his own right, master of vast estates, lord of 100 manors, and commander of the great fortress that bore his new title. In an England collapsing under royal weakness, that made him untouchable. His power was territorial, financial, and, increasingly, political. By the early 1450s, England was sliding toward chaos. King Henry VI's mind had broken under the weight of kingship. For months he drifted in silence, incapable of rule. His queen, Margaret of Anjou, tried to hold the realm together through ruthless favoritism, surrounding herself with courtiers despised by the nobles. Meanwhile, the House of York, led by Richard, Duke of York, positioned itself as the kingdom's saviour. Warwick and his father threw their lot in with York, not out of sentiment, but calculation. The Nevilles had enemies among the Lancastrians. Aligning with York offered protection and perhaps destiny. Yet this alliance was more than political convenience. Warwick possessed what York lacked: charisma, wealth, and control of Calais, England's last stronghold on French soil. From that fortress, Warwick commanded the Channel, controlling trade, piracy, and diplomacy alike. No one could move ships or silver without his leave. Europe knew his name. Ambassadors sought his favour before the king's. By 1458, he had become a power broker, unlike any in English memory. Chroniclers wrote of his public processions, thousands of retainers in crimson and white, banners fluttering, trumpets echoing through the streets of London. The people adored him. They saw in him what the monarchy no longer provided: decisiveness, protection, and spectacle. But admiration breeds resentment, and every rise plants the seed of its own fall. Warwick's loyalty to the Duke of York deepened as England's divisions hardened. In 1459, the fragile truce between the factions shattered at Blore Heath and Ludford Bridge. The Yorkists were forced to flee. Warwick himself barely escaped to Calais, where his fleet kept him safe from the king's wrath. Yet exile only magnified his legend. From Calais, he launched raids across the Channel, seized royal ships, and declared himself the defender of true governance. In the eyes of many, he had become the protector of the realm against tyranny. In reality, he was shaping the stage for his next creation, a new monarch of his choosing. The storm was gathering, and the red and white roses were about to draw blood once more. By the dawn of 1459, England was no longer a kingdom. It was a chessboard of banners and betrayals. The Wars of the Roses had begun, a brutal dynastic struggle between the House of Lancaster, bearing the red rose, and the House of York, bearing the white. In this gathering storm, one man stood at the centre of every move: Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. To his allies, he was a champion of order. To his enemies, a dangerous opportunist. To history, he would become something far greater. When the Duke of York fled into exile after the failed uprising at Ludford Bridge, Warwick retreated to his fortress at Calais, England's last toehold in France. From its towering walls, overlooking the Grey Channel, he held more power than the king himself. His fleet commanded the sea, his garrison, fiercely loyal, owed him their livelihoods. While Henry VI hid behind his courtiers and Queen Margaret plotted revenge, Warwick ruled from across the water like a sovereign in exile. In the summer of 1460, Warwick struck back. Crossing the Channel with a small but determined army, he landed at Sandwich, rallied Kentish men to his banner, and marched toward London. The capital, weary of Lancastrian corruption, opened its gates. The rebellion had returned, not in whispers, but in thunder. On July 10, 1460, at the Battle of Northampton, Warwick led the Yorkist army against the royal forces. The fighting was fierce but brief. Rain and betrayal undid the king's army. Henry VI was captured once again. Warwick treated him with deference, bowing, even kneeling before the bewildered monarch. But it was the gesture of a master toward a puppet. From that moment, England's destiny flowed through Warwick's hands. Yet power is never still. When the Duke of York returned to claim the throne later that year, declaring himself rightful king, even Warwick hesitated. To depose an anointed monarch outright was dangerous, sacrilege in the eyes of many. The compromise that followed was fragile. Henry would remain king for life, but York was named heir. Queen Margaret, however, would not forgive such humiliation. war followed her vengeance. In December 1460 at Wakefield, the Duke of York was killed, his head crowned with paper and displayed on the gates of York. The rebellion seemed crushed, but from its ashes rose York's 19-year-old son, Edward, tall, magnetic, born to command, and Warwick, ever the judge of men, saw in him the image of kingship England hungered for. Together, they rallied their forces and marched south. In February 1461, Warwick held London once more. He presented young Edward to the cheering crowds, not as a claimant, but as a king. The people shouted his name. The city echoed with hope and defiance. And then came Towton. Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1461. Snow, sleet, and death. Nearly 60,000 men clashed in the fields of Yorkshire. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. Blinded by storm and smoke, men killed their kin without knowing it. Warwick fought beside Edward, leading charges, rallying lines, shaping the chaos into victory. When the sun finally broke through the clouds, the Lancastrians lay broken. Henry VI fled into exile. Edward was proclaimed King of England, and at his side stood the architect of triumph, the Kingmaker. Warwick had achieved the impossible. He had toppled one dynasty and raised another. But in lifting Edward to the throne, he had set in motion the chain of events that would one day destroy them both. In the spring of 1461, London erupted in celebration. Trumpets blared from the tower, church bells rang for days, and banners of white and gold fluttered over the Thames. England had a new king, Edward IV, tall, handsome, and commanding. At his side stood the architect of it all, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. To the people, Warwick was not just a nobleman. He was the maker of kings, the saviour of the realm. Chroniclers wrote that all England was ruled by Warwick. His estates provided food for armies. His ships guarded the channel. His retainers, thousands strong, patrolled the roads like royal soldiers. The new king owed everything to him. Or so Warwick believed. Edward IV was not Henry VI. He was bold where Henry was timid, decisive where Henry had faltered. At only 19, he possessed the charm of a warrior king, loved by soldiers and adored by women. His victory at Towton had made him a symbol of national renewal. But behind the pageantry, the young monarch was learning quickly that power, once shared, must eventually be claimed. For a time, their alliance seemed unbreakable. Warwick directed policy, diplomacy, and the royal council. When foreign envoys arrived, it was Warwick they met first, and often last. He arranged trade deals, oversaw the minting of coin, and controlled the royal marriage negotiations that could shape Europe's balance of power. In 1462, he negotiated with France for peace. In 1464, he turned to Burgundy for alliance. To foreign courts, Warwick was England. But the king had begun to see the world differently. While Warwick played the grand statesman, Edward played the politician. He understood that the age of baronial overreach had to end. The crown could not endure if it bent to a subject's will, even to the man who had raised it from ruin. Warwick's authority, once indispensable, was now suffocating. The first fracture came quietly, through love. While Warwick negotiated a royal marriage between Edward and a French princess, the young king was hiding a secret. He had already married, not for alliance, but for passion. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville, a widowed commoner of modest nobility and striking beauty. Their marriage, performed in secret in 1464, shocked the realm when it was revealed. To Warwick, it was an unforgivable betrayal. His careful diplomacy, his strategy to bind England and France, had been undone by a king's impulse. Worse still, Elizabeth's large, ambitious family began to fill the court, taking lands, titles, and marriages that Warwick had planned for his own allies. Overnight, his influence began to slip. Resentment turned to rivalry. The court split into factions, the Woodvilles on one side, Warwick's followers on the other. Whispers filled the corridors of Westminster that the king no longer heeded the man who had made him. In council, Warwick's temper flared. He called the Woodvilles greedy, reckless, and unworthy of the crown's favour. Edward, equally proud, reminded him that England had one king, not two. The Kingmaker had created a monarch, now that monarch had learned to rule without him. By 1467, the friendship that had once rebuilt England had curdled into suspicion. Warwick felt slighted, isolated, betrayed. His pride, once his armour, began to turn against him, and in the silence between them, England's next war began to take shape. By the late 1460s, the alliance that had rebuilt a kingdom was collapsing from within. The bond between Edward IV and Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, once ironclad, had turned brittle, poisoned by pride, ambition, and betrayal. At court, the new order revolved around the Woodvilles, Queen Elizabeth's vast and hungry family. Brothers, uncles, cousins, all rose with astonishing speed, marrying into noble houses and seizing influence once reserved for Warwick's circle. The Kingmaker, who had placed Edward on the throne, guided his policies and forged his alliances, now found himself excluded from decisions he once controlled. To the courtiers who once trembled before him, he was still dangerous, but no longer essential, and nothing cut deeper than irrelevance. Warwick was a man who thrived in control. He had brokered thrones, shaped diplomacy, commanded armies. But now letters went unanswered. The king delayed audiences. The young monarch, who had once leaned on his counsel, now lectured him. In private, Warwick's frustration turned to fury. He began to speak openly of the Woodvilles' corruption, of the king's vanity and betrayal. His words found eager ears among the discontented nobility, especially in the north, where the Nevilles still held sway. The spark of rebellion had been lit. In 1467, Edward humiliated his former mentor before foreign ambassadors, siding publicly with Burgundy over France, directly opposing Warwick's policy. It was a calculated insult, and Warwick understood the message: your time is over. He withdrew from court, nursing his anger. But withdrawal was not surrender. Warwick had one last card to play: blood. His eldest daughter, Isabel Neville, was betrothed to George, Duke of Clarence, Edward's ambitious younger brother. The king forbade the marriage, knowing that such a union could forge a dangerous alliance. But Warwick ignored him. He sailed to Calais, where, before cheering soldiers and priests, Isabel and George were married in defiance of royal command. The act was treason in all but name. From that moment, the Kingmaker no longer served the crown. He opposed it. In 1469, rebellion erupted across England. Discontented nobles and peasants alike rose in protest against Edward's policies and the Woodville dominance. Though Warwick's name was never written on their banners, everyone knew who guided the hand behind the curtain. That summer, Edward IV marched north to crush the uprising, but found himself betrayed. Warwick's agents intercepted royal messages. His forces ambushed the king's columns. The monarch was captured and brought, humiliated, to Warwick's castle at Middleham. For a few extraordinary weeks, the Kingmaker ruled again. Yet power gained by deceit cannot endure. The realm refused to accept another overthrow. The nobles, wary of open treason, refused to serve without the king's sanction. Facing chaos, Warwick reluctantly released Edward. For a moment, peace returned. But it was an illusion, a calm before a greater storm. In 1470, after a second failed rebellion, Warwick and Clarence fled into exile in France. There, amid the courts of Europe, the man who had made a king prepared to make another, but this time, in a twist history could scarcely imagine. He would ally with the very woman he once swore to destroy. Queen Margaret of Anjou, wife of the deposed Henry VI. Enemies would become allies. The Kingmaker would become the Kingbreaker. Exile has a way of clarifying ambition. In the spring of 1470, Richard Neville, once the master of England, found himself a hunted man, stripped of lands, titles, and purpose. But exile did not break him. It transformed him. Across the Channel, in France, Warwick arrived at the glittering court of King Louis XVIII, a spider at the center of Europe's diplomatic web. The French king saw in Warwick both a weapon and a legend, the man who could make or unmake monarchs. He understood that England's chaos was France's opportunity. So Louis proposed the unthinkable. He urged Warwick, the champion of the Yorkist cause, to reconcile with his former enemies, the Lancastrians. For years, Warwick had fought to destroy them. He had hunted Queen Margaret of Anjou, the fierce and indomitable wife of the deposed King Henry VI. Yet now, in a candlelit chamber at Angers, he knelt before her, pledging loyalty to the very house he had once overthrown. Chroniclers record that the Queen made him wait in silence before speaking, forcing him to taste humiliation. But she too was desperate. Her husband languished in the Tower of London, and her son, Prince Edward of Lancaster, had no throne. Each needed the other, and so enemies became partners in vengeance. To seal the alliance, Warwick gave his younger daughter, Anne Neville, in marriage to Prince Edward, uniting the fortunes of Neville and Lancaster. The Kingmaker had chosen his new king, a puppet of the past reborn through his ambition. That autumn, with French ships at his back and the red rose on his banners, Warwick invaded England. The effect was electric. Nobles who had once betrayed Lancaster now saw the tide shifting again. Armies rallied to his cause. Edward IV, caught off guard, was forced to flee across the North Sea into exile. London opened its gates. Henry VI, pale and broken, was led out of the Tower and placed once more upon the throne. The crowds cheered, not for the frail monarch, but for the man who stood behind him. The Kingmaker had returned. For a brief, astonishing season, Warwick ruled England. He restored order to the treasury, recalled exiled nobles, and sought to heal a kingdom scarred by war. Even those who despised him admitted his brilliance. Yet beneath the triumph lay fragility. Henry VI was a king in name only, meek, devout, and detached from reality. Warwick governed in his stead, signing royal documents, receiving ambassadors, commanding armies. To foreign courts, there was no doubt who truly ruled. But far across the sea, in Burgundy, Edward IV waited, watching, planning, and gathering strength. In March 1471, Edward returned to England with a small but determined force. The nation held its breath. Would Warwick defend his crown's creation, or crumble under the weight of his own contradictions? At first, fortune seemed to favour the returning king. Cities opened their gates. Old allies reappeared. Even George, Duke of Clarence, Warwick's son-in-law, betrayed him, rejoining his brother Edward. The Kingmaker found himself isolated once more, trapped by the very politics he had mastered. As spring turned to April, two armies began to march toward a collision that would decide England's fate and Warwick's destiny. The man who made kings was about to face the king he had betrayed. March 1471. The snows were melting, and with them the illusion of Warwick's victory. Across the North Sea, a ship under Burgundian sails cut through the grey waters toward the English coast. On board stood King Edward IV, the lion in exile, returning to reclaim his crown. England had seen kings rise and fall before, but never had a monarch returned with such precision, such ruthless clarity of purpose. Edward had learned from the Kingmaker himself, and now he would use those lessons against his former master. Landing at Ravenspur in Yorkshire, Edward came ashore with only a few hundred men. Yet his gamble was bold. He proclaimed not rebellion, but loyalty. He swore he sought only his hereditary dukedom, not the crown. It was deception, but it worked. Town after town opened its gates. Men remembered his charisma, his victories, his youth. The people still loved their king. Within weeks, his army had swelled into thousands. Meanwhile, in London, Henry VI sat quietly on the throne he no longer ruled. The real power, Warwick, scrambled to rally forces from the Midlands and North, but hesitation was his enemy. The network of loyalty he had built for years began to crack under strain. Too many nobles doubted his new allegiance to Lancaster. Others, fearing Edward's vengeance, defected before battle was even joined. As Edward advanced southward, fate dealt Warwick another blow. George, Duke of Clarence, his own son-in-law, switched sides once more, riding out to kneel before his brother Edward. The betrayal was complete. In that moment, Warwick understood what he had created. He had taught men to seize crowns, to wield ambition without restraint, and now those same lessons were being turned against him. By early April, Edward entered London in triumph. The gates opened without a fight. Henry VI was quietly taken back to the Tower. The people who once cheered for Warwick now shouted Edward's name. The crown had found its rightful head again, at least in the eyes of those who survived long enough to tell the tale. But Warwick was not done. For all his political missteps, he was still a soldier, and a brilliant one. He gathered what forces remained and marched south to meet the returning king. His banners, the bare and ragged staff, still commanded loyalty among the hardened veterans of the north. Alongside him rode his brother, John Neville, Marquis of Montague, a man of equal courage and fatal loyalty. The confrontation was inevitable. The place, Barnet, a small town north of London. The date, April 14th, 1471. Warwick's army outnumbered Edward's, and his position was strong. On the eve of battle, he moved among his men, calm and resolute. Chroniclers say he wore no armour upon his face, declaring, "I will die, as I have lived, a true Englishman." At dawn, a dense fog rolled over the fields, smothering vision and sowing confusion. Banners disappeared into the mist. Trumpets blared blindly into silence. Somewhere in that grey void, England's fate was being decided. As swords clashed and lines blurred, Warwick's forces, unable to see their own standards, turned upon each other by mistake. His advantage dissolved in chaos. Edward's men surged forward with disciplined fury. When the fog finally lifted, the field of Barnet was red with the blood of thousands. Warwick's army broke. The Kingmaker was thrown from his horse and cut down as he fought to rally his men. He died not as a plotter, but as a warrior, sword in hand, surrounded by the ruin of his ambition. The lion had returned, and the age of the Kingmaker was over. Dawn Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1471. A thick, unnatural fog lay heavy over the fields north of Barnet. A grey veil that swallowed banners, muffled sound, and turned the battlefield into a nightmare. On one ridge stood Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, his banners of the bare and ragged staff barely visible in the mist. Opposite him, invisible but close, waited King Edward IV, his royal standard marked by the blazing sun. Between them stretched a few hundred yards of nothingness, the silence before destiny. Warwick's plan was sound. He held the higher ground, his flanks secure, his archers ready. His brother John Neville, Marquis of Montague, commanded the centre, while Oxford and Exeter took the wings. The Kingmaker had fought a dozen battles before. This one, he believed, would restore his supremacy and strike down the monarch he had made. But the fog, silent, impartial, merciless, had other designs. As trumpets blared and drums rolled through the grey, the armies advanced blindly. Arrows vanished into the mist. Men stumbled upon enemies without seeing them until the clash of steel was already in their ears. Shouts of "God and St. George" echoed in confusion, friend and foe answering the same cry. On Warwick's left, Oxford's troops surged forward and broke through Edward's flank, driving them back into the fog. It seemed victory was near, but in the swirling haze, Oxford's men lost direction. When they returned, their star and crescent badges glimmered faintly in the gloom. Too faint, too unfamiliar. Montague's men mistook them for Edward's soldiers and opened fire. Panic spread like wildfire. The Lancastrian line fractured. Commands were lost. Men turned their blades upon their own allies. The Kingmaker's army, larger and better positioned, began to dissolve before his eyes. Edward seized the moment. His centre pushed hard through the confusion, his banner, the sun in splendour, blazing briefly through the fog. He fought in the thick of it, striking blows with his own hand. The king's discipline, drilled in exile, began to triumph over Warwick's fractured strength. By midday, the field was a chaos of screams and corpses. The fog refused to lift, as if the heavens themselves wished to hide the slaughter. When Warwick's line finally broke, Montague was struck down and killed. The Kingmaker, refusing to flee, fought on, trying to rally what remained of his men. His horse was slain beneath him. He continued on foot, surrounded. Some said he was cut down while trying to reach his brother's body. Others, that he died facing the royal guard head-on, unarmored, defiant to the end. However it happened, when the fog finally cleared, the mightiest subject in England lay still, a crimson pool spreading beneath him. When Edward's soldiers stripped the dead, they recognized him at once. The news spread quickly through the camp. The Kingmaker is fallen. His body was taken to London, displayed at St. Paul's Cathedral. Not in triumph, but as warning. Thousands came to see it, to look upon the man who had made and unmade kings. Thus ended Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, once the Master of Thrones. In his death, England lost not merely a lord, but an idea that a single man could command the course of dynasties. The fog at Barnet did not just end a battle, it ended an age. The fog of Barnet had barely lifted when England began to reckon with what it had lost and what it had become. The corpse of Richard Neville, the once invincible Earl of Warwick, lay cold beneath the vaulted stones of St. Paul's Cathedral. Crowds gathered to see him. The man who had made kings, now motionless, stripped of armor and grandeur. Chroniclers record that his face, even in death, retained its calm authority, as though the Kingmaker had fallen asleep rather than fallen from power. For a moment, England stood still, and then the storm moved on. Only weeks after Barnet, a second battle erupted, Tewkesbury, May 1471. There, King Edward IV crushed the last Lancastrian army and sealed his rule. Queen Margaret of Anjou was captured, and her son, Prince Edward of Lancaster, Warwick's son-in-law, was killed in the field. Within the Tower of London, Henry VI, frail and broken, met a quiet death soon after. The red rose of Lancaster withered, and the white rose of York reigned supreme. Warwick's grand vision, a balanced kingdom governed by noble counsel, died with him. Edward IV's rule, firm and unchallenged, marked the dawn of a new reality, a monarchy that no longer shared power. Before Warwick, kings had depended on magnates, the great houses who balanced crown and country. After Warwick, kings learned that survival meant control. The crown would rise above the nobility, no longer their equal but their master. The Kingmaker's legend, however, refused to fade. His enemies feared his memory, his allies mourned his greatness. Even chroniclers who despised his ambition admitted his genius. Polydore Virgil would later write, "He was beloved of the people and feared of the great." His death marked the end of the age of overmighty subjects, the last time a single noble could command the loyalty of nations and the fear of kings. Yet his influence reached far beyond his lifetime. Warwick's family was shattered but not erased. His daughter Anne Neville, widowed at Tewkesbury, would later marry Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the future King Richard III. Through her, the Kingmaker's blood would flow into another crown, binding his legacy to one of the most dramatic reigns in English history. And beyond Richard III's fall came a new dynasty, the Tudors. They would rule with an iron lesson learned from Warwick's fate, that no man outside the crown must ever hold such power again. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, deliberately dismantled the old feudal networks that had birthed men like Warwick. He created a centralized, disciplined monarchy, efficient, feared, absolute. In that sense, the Kingmaker shaped the very system that would never allow another Kingmaker to exist. But his legend endures for another reason. Not merely because he made and unmade kings, but because he embodied the dangerous dream of control. His rise was proof that intelligence, wealth, and courage could outmatch royal blood. His fall was proof that destiny bends to no man. For a generation, England had been his board. Every move, every alliance, every betrayal, played with precision. Yet in the end, the game consumed the player. The chronicles close on him with a paradox. A man too great to serve and too human to rule. He was never crowned. He never ruled as king. Yet for nearly 2 decades, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, bent the course of English history to his will. He could summon armies with a gesture. He could raise men to glory or cast them into ruin. His name carried more weight than any royal decree. And in the end, it was that power, the illusion that he could play God, that destroyed him. In the chronicles of his age, Warwick is both hero and villain, architect and arsonist. To the commons, he was a champion, the noble who defied corruption, who stood for justice when kings faltered. To the royal houses of Lancaster and York, he was a force of nature, brilliant, unpredictable, and terrifyingly ambitious. He began as a loyal servant, a warrior for order, but like many who hold the reins too tightly, he forgot that power, once tasted, demands more. His gift was his downfall, the conviction that he understood England better than her kings. At first, he made Edward IV to restore peace, then he unmade him to reclaim control, and in doing so, he shattered both crown and country. The tragedy of Warwick is not only his death at Barnet, it is his blindness to the limits of mastery. He could command armies but not hearts. He could place crowns but not guarantee loyalty. The very kings he created, Henry and Edward, were mirrors of his own contradictions. Strength wrapped in insecurity, faith corrupted by ambition. In the end, history does not remember him as a traitor. It remembers him as a warning. The Kingmaker became the symbol of a truth that echoes through every age, that the pursuit of absolute power, even in the name of order, always consumes itself. His fall marked the death of feudal England and the birth of centralized monarchy. After him, no noble would ever wield such dominion again. And yet there is a strange immortality in his failure. His name endures not because he ruled, but because he changed the way rulers were made. The Tudors who followed would draw their power from his example and his ruin. When one walks through the ruins of Warwick Castle, it is easy to imagine his shadow still there. The grand halls echoing with his commands, the firelight glinting off armor, the air heavy with the scent of iron and decision. His was a world where loyalty was fragile, crowns were fragile, and even destiny could be rewritten for a time. But power, like fire, burns those who believe they control it. From his rise as the people's hero to his fall in the fog of Barnet, Warwick's story is the story of every age, of men who build greatness, not by wearing the crown, but by deciding who should. He was a king in everything but name, and perhaps that was the problem, because no man can play God forever. History remembers the crowns, the banners, and the thrones. But behind every king stands a hand that shaped the moment. Unseen, unthanked, indispensable. Richard Neville reminds us that influence can be more powerful than authority, and that the hunger to control destiny is both a gift and a curse. He made kings, he unmade them, and in the end, he made history itself. If his story teaches us anything, it's this. Power may build an empire, but character decides how long it stands.